The Boatman by Eric Dean. Narrated by Rish Outfield. I awoke cold beneath a starless sky. Wisps of green and blue clouds drifted slowly overhead, and a cool breeze touched my skin. The pins and needles of my waking limbs roused me to shift my weight. My fingers grasped wet sand, and with some difficulty I rolled to one hip and tried to focus my eyes on the only thing I could find. A line, a division of color, a boundary between brown and iridescent blue-green. A sandy shore, churning water. I tried to think back to the last thing I could remember. I sat up, hugging my legs, looking around for something familiar. The shoreline stretched as far as I could see in either direction, disappearing in a thick fog, lit eerily from beneath by the strange, glowing water. Behind me, the sands stretched into dunes that disappeared into dense black smoke. "Hello?" I screamed. "Is anyone there? Hello?" I didn't know how I got here. I didn't know where I'd left my clothes. I tried to stand, faltered, and fell to my hands and knees. Panicked, I began to crawl. I searched the wet sand for signs, evidence of a party, footprints, anything. I found nothing. "Hello? Please! Help! Help!" I was still for a moment, cold but not shivering, and took a deep breath. The air stung my lungs, and the smell, dead fish and flowery perfume. Had I not been breathing before now? I lifted my head and gazed out into the luminescent fog. A sound. Something moving in the water. Again. A quiet swishing, sloshing, moving closer. I scooted backward through the sand. The pins and needles in my palms burned. I rolled to my hands and knees clumsily and tried to stand. But my legs wobbled and gave out beneath me, and I rolled again to my back. An ache spread through my bones. I lifted my head and looked toward the fog bank in time to see it whirl into two cyclones that moved apart from one another, opening like curtains away from the radiant water. Across the water slid what appeared to be a long canoe with a person standing up in the rear and rowing with a long pole. The figure lifted and pulled the pole forward through the water with a soft swish. As the boat moved closer, further out of the fog, the blue-green light lit the stained folds of a dirty, hooded robe. Hey! I need help!" The boat slid gracefully from the water. At least a third of its length rested on the sand, not 50 yards from me. The robed and hooded figure pulled its pole from the water and rested it upright, like a walking stick, inside the long boat. The pole had to be at least 20 feet long, with a broad, bell-shaped lobe on the bottom end. I crawled as best I could. My arms and legs ached with piercing pain. I pulled ragged breaths, with purpose, and threw myself forward across the wet sand. My knees and elbows sank deeper into the sand with every forward plunge, and the smells of rot and pungent perfume stung my nostrils. "Please, help!" I cried again, gasping for breath. The sand was softer near the water, almost swampy. I had resigned to inching forward on my belly, clawing at the cold, oatmeal-like substance beneath me, struggling to keep my face above it, tilting my head back and pulling in air through clenched teeth. "Help me!" I choked to the robed figure, who stood perfectly still only feet away. I felt my legs sinking into the slurry behind me. It was ice cold beneath the surface, and my legs instantly went numb. I swam my arms through the swampy sand as fast as I could, struggling to stay above the surface, reaching wildly for the ship's narrow bow. My flailing attempt failed, and I found myself sliding below into the cold. My body began to go numb, and I surrendered. I felt the wooden pole in my palm and quickly closed both fists around it tightly. My hands slid down to the bell-shaped end, and I felt a great strength pulling me upward. The cold sand hugged tighter, but my body slipped from its grasp, and I was pulled roughly over the side of the ship and onto hard, damp planks. I curled up and shivered, spitting and gasping for air as prickly feelings returned to my legs. I opened my eyes and glanced up at the figure, returning its pole to rest upright at its side, and standing otherwise silent and still.
Creasome plurimis,
he hummed, in a voice like the echo of a dusty bagpipe in an old whiskey barrel, his thin blue lips barely parting. "Thank you. Oh, my God, thank you so much," I whimpered, covering my naked body as best I could with my hands. "Thank you so much. I thought I was going to die. I don't know how I got here."
"You have,"
hummed the figure, in a deep and resonant whisper. It reached out a hand toward me, the sleeve of its grease-smeared robe drawing back on its arm, revealing a withered, bony hand. I reached for the hand, and it withdrew. Again the figure extended its wiry hand, and again I reached for it. But again it withdrew. "Huh?" I said, my mouth open, searching for the right words. We remained in silence for a long moment, before the figure reached up and grasped its linen hood, drawing it back over a slick of tarnished silver hair, which hung long around a pale and drawn face. Mottled gray skin stretched taut over too many angles of bone, and a wet and tangled mop of ashen beard hung tucked into the darkness of linen. His forehead stretched back to the crown of his head. Around his eyes and mouth, wrinkles cascaded like rings of an ancient tree carved in translucent flesh. As his head raised, pale blue coals burned cold in sunken sockets, and I knew him from a time immemorial. A terrible familiarity covered me like a blanket of spiders, and the weight of realization flattened me against the timbers of the decaying skiff. "I'm dead," I said softly. Are you Death?"
"I require payment,"
he replied, enunciating his way carefully through each syllable. For the first time, he seemed to see me. His cold eyes narrowed, and he looked me over.
"I see. You have no currency."
I sat up and hugged my legs against my chest. The feeling of my flesh pressing against itself made me nauseous. "Am I dead?"
"You are."
"Are you Death?"
"Death brought you here,"
he said, meeting my gaze. His eyes were wild and alert, calculating and discerning, but not malicious. He tapped his fingertips in sequence up the wooden shaft of his pole.
"The boatman will carry you across."
I suddenly remembered the myths. The boatman carried the souls of the dead across the river Styx. A dark bloom of profound sadness blossomed in my chest. How did I die? What happened?" He shook his head gently.
"The way forward lies beyond the far shore."
"Your name is Sharon, right?" The boatman's cold eyes narrowed again, and he tilted his head slightly to one side.
"You call the boatman many names, among them Charon and Charon, he of keen gaze."
I massaged my limbs to quell the burning sensation in my muscles, but the pressure sent waves of dizziness through my skull. I took a deep breath. Fish. Perfume. "So, I have to pay you, and you row me across the river Styx to Hades? Purgatory?" Cheiron was gazing out at the empty shore and the thick, roiling smoke in the desert beyond. A moment passed, and I repeated my question. "Do I have to pay?"
You call this water Acheron. Beyond it is formlessness and timelessness.
He motioned gracefully with the back of his gnarled hand, still gazing out at the impossible wall of smoke behind me.
If you cannot pay, you must wait.
What do you mean? Wait for what?
When you cannot pay, you wander the shore for 100 years.
He motioned again with his hand, more forcefully, and reached up to lower his cowl. What? What do you mean 100 years? I tried to stand, but my legs suddenly seized, and I collapsed forward into the skiff, falling over one of the horizontal planks intended as a seat. Pain exploded through my face, and my head swam. Suddenly, Cheiron's icy hand grabbed the flesh on the back of my neck like a kitten by the scruff, and held me at eye level. My feet dangled above the hull. I hadn't realized, until now, how tall Cheiron stood. Well over 6 feet, I was certain.
You are no longer flesh. Your mind reaches out for a body and grasps at its absence with confusion.
What? Cheiron's face softened. Some of the creases and angles seemed to fade like a slowly melting ice sculpture.
If you wish to appear to stand, then appear to do so. If you wish to appear to move, then appear to do so. All of this is only as you expect it to be.
With a quick jerk, Cheiron flung me out of the boat and into the icy, swampy quicksand of the shore's edge. As the cold darkness again enveloped me, I heard his dry, woodwind voice in my ear.
You must wander the shore for 100 years.
I was overwhelmed. I was exhausted. I sank slowly, trying to remember how I'd gotten here. How had I died so young? I tried to remember something romantic or tragic about my life. I tried to picture a familiar face. Of a lost love, perhaps. I did remember a face. Olive skin and long, dark hair that blew across her face and stuck to her lips when she smiled. Hazel eyes that danced everywhere around me. Who did this face belong to? I think I loved her. What was her name? I remember her lying in a hospital bed and holding a crying baby. Was it mine? Those hazel eyes finding mine. Love. I remember a small child playing in the sun, ringlets of red hair falling around her happy, freckled face. She had a little straw hat that matched her mother's. I'm sitting nearby watching, smiling. The red-haired girl is graduating now. She's wearing a long blue satin robe, and my heart is filled with pride. The olive-skinned woman is sitting next to me, holding my hand. We're both crying. The red-haired girl is wearing a wedding gown, looking back over her shoulder at me, and crying. I'm still holding her mother's hand. The red-haired girl is holding a baby. The baby has a mess of curly blonde hair around its head. I'm holding the little blonde baby and rocking it in my arms. A curly-headed blonde child is opening Christmas presents in front of a tree. The red-headed woman is taking pictures. The olive-skinned woman sits nearby, sipping from a mug. Her face is aged, but her hazel eyes still glow with warmth. I'm tired. So tired. Hovering over me, 3 faces. These 3 women, all gazing down at me with love in their smiles. They're holding my hands and crying. I'm smiling, trying to tell them it's okay. To stop crying. I'm so tired. So relaxed. I awoke on the sand. Rotting fish and floral perfume. I was dead. I'd lived an entire life, and I had died in the presence of the ones I loved most. I lifted my head from the sand and looked down at my young, naked body. I had died an old man, but this wasn't my body. I had no brain and no neurons to fire. I had no nerves and no muscles to command. This was just a reflection of the body of my youth. I wished it to appear to rise, and it rose. I stood effortlessly, as if falling in reverse, and I felt weightless. There was no pain, nor any feeling whatsoever. I took in a deep breath and continued inhaling. I inhaled far beyond the capacity of any human lungs. The air was a constant inward flow, and then there was no air. The smells of fish and perfume faded. I closed my eyes and saw just as clearly, because I had no eyes to close. The fog at the river bank opened as twin cyclones in front of me, and from between them slid the old wooden skiff, gliding easily across the sand and coming to rest beside me. Charon pulled back his hood, but didn't look in my direction. He motioned me into the boat, and I stepped in and took a seat. I thought I had to wander for 100 years.
And you have,
he replied. I don't understand much of this. I'm sure you're used to that. Charon pushed the long pole into the sand and pushed the skiff back out into the iridescent water.
You never do.
Have I done this before? Is this not the first time I've died?
You are always dying. The boatman is always here to carry you across when you wish to go.
So I've lived and died many times? What about everyone else? People die every few seconds, but I don't see anyone else here, I said, running my fingertips along the edge of the skiff. I knew that my fingertips weren't actually there, but the wood felt exactly as I expected it to. It was damp, rough, and splintered.
Time has no meaning here,
Charon hummed, his mouth motionless in the nest of his wiry beard. Okay, so this place is outside of time. Why, then, did you tell me I had to wander for 100 years, and then you came back almost immediately? Charon took a moment, and then looked down with his fiery blue eyes. Though my body was only a reflection, it shivered beneath the weight of his gaze. He seemed to regard me for the first time as he spoke.
This place is a reflection of your expectations. Years and wandering are meaningless here. The expression is one that you yourself have imposed upon this place, and the boatman facilitates it.
So, what caused you to return?
You did.
We sat in silence. Attempting to converse with Charon reminded me of sinking in the quicksand. Charon's cloak rippled, and the fog rolled around us. I gazed off the side of the boat into the glowing water, and was startled and horrified by what I saw. The water writhed with the faces of men and women. Countless eyes stared up at me with a haunting familiarity. They reached up in unison, but could not reach the surface. Their images rippled with the water and dissipated, reformed, joined, and separated. Their faces were twisted in horror and confusion. I sat back from the water, a numbness returning briefly to my imaginary body. Who are those people in the water? I asked.
You often attempt to cross on your own.
Look, Charon, I realize you're a god or an eternal being, but you don't have to speak to me like one. Just for a minute, acknowledge that I don't know what's going on here, and speak to me like a human being. You keep saying you, like I've been here before. Charon looked down at me sternly, and I saw the slightest furrow in his brow. I relaxed my imaginary posture and made the gesture of sighing aloud. I'm sorry. Just please dumb it down for me. I would really like to understand this. Charon looked up from where I sat and seemed to take in the scenery around him. He then lifted one of his hands in front of his face and looked at both the front and back of it, flexing his gnarled fingers and then running a finger across his own thin blue lips. He blinked his cold eyes, and the fires within them dimmed.
"You are always confused when I speak of the universal you," he began,
his mouth actually moving as he spoke.
"You, each of you, must make this journey alone. I carry each of you across alone, though you are always crossing. Sometimes you choose to cross without me, and you lose yourself here."
He motioned to the water and glanced over the side of the boat. "So, the people who try to swim across get stuck here?"
"You cannot cross without the boatmen."
"So, when you told me I had to wander for 100 years, why did you come back? I know you said time means nothing, but I still don't understand."
"To cross requires that you willingly accept the end of one journey and the beginning of another. Voluntarily paying the toll shows a willingness to cross. Those who cannot pay must reach that acceptance on their own. Sometimes it may feel as though it takes 100 years. This time you felt as though it was almost immediate."
"So, if I tried to swim across without you, it shows a lack of acceptance?"
"Yes. Those who cling to life cannot cross over. They remain here, and like an unmoving river, become stagnant."
"So," I asked, "when people pay you, what do you do with the coins?"
"When you pay the boatman, you show a willing acceptance to cross over. The coins are only symbols, like everything else here. They are no more real than your body. When you no longer have need of the symbols, they simply cease to be."
"You keep referring to a collective you," I said.
"Yes,"
Charon replied.
"You are uncomfortable with it."
The corners of Charon's mouth twitched.
"Mankind is one being. You impose individuality upon yourself. You take it up at birth, and it seems to be the most difficult thing you shed upon passing."
"For the sake of the conversation, Charon, can we establish my individuality as a given, at least for the time being? Is the abandonment of my individuality a necessary part of my crossing?"
"As you wish," he replied. "No, the only requirement is willingness to cross."
"All right, now we're getting somewhere. Speaking of individuality, why do you always refer to yourself in the third person?"
"The boatman is the outward symbol of a function. This form facilitates that function."
"Clearly, though, you are a being. You have a name. What is an individual but a unique perspective, a collection and sum of senses? Do you not possess a unique perspective?" Charon tilted his head back, and one corner of his mouth curled into what could have been a slight smile, countless wrinkles and creases spreading across the side of his face, like ripples through water.
"I do. However, Charon is a descriptor. It is a form of a word meaning of keen gaze. Karobos. As your language changed, the meaning of this word fell away."
"But doesn't Adam, the name of the first man in the Bible, also just mean man in ancient Hebrew?"
"It means of blood and earth, a description of man's mythical origin," Charon replied.
"A description which became a name, as did yours. Can we consider you an individual with the name Charon?"
"We can,"
said Charon, a slightly brassier quality in his voice. "All right, Charon," I said. "What about you, then? Where do you come from?" Charon considered the question. His face appeared more animated. His eyes gained depth.
Your question is difficult to answer, as it imposes limitations upon that which is limitless. But, simply, as long as there has been life and death, I have been here to facilitate it.
So, forever?
If by forever you mean eternity, then no. The act of souls imposing life and death upon themselves has been a finite circumstance, and it did not come to be suddenly, but gradually, and thus I gradually came to be as well. The me who stands before you is merely the current incarnation of the function which I have always served.
Why then, I continued, choose this form? Who built this boat? And why a river? Why any of it?
You, meaning mankind, have chosen these symbols and imposed them upon this process with your expectations. Not all see it as you see it. It is a very personal experience for each individual incarnation of consciousness that experiences the crossing. You ask me who built the boat, but the answer is you. You did.
I sat back, looking from side to side at the weathered planks forming the long gray skiff. I knocked against it with my imaginary knuckles, and it felt and sounded exactly as I expected it to. So, what's on the other side?
I don't know,
Charon said, without hesitation.
We don't often have this conversation, but this question is quite common. I do not know. I have never been alive, and thus I've never died. I exist solely to facilitate the crossing, and this is all I've ever known.
You don't know? At all? Can't you, I don't know, see it when you're over there? Charon smiled. I swear he actually smiled, if only for a moment, before his pale prune of a face relaxed.
This place, as I've said, is only a reflection of what the living expect it to be. Those who cross over do not return to this place, nor do they affect the way it appears. The place they go when they cross over does not exist here, nor is there anything to see into.
All right, fair enough. So, what do you think it is? I asked.
I've never conjectured.
You've never wondered?
No. The living conjecture about the place they will go after death, instead of fully experiencing the place they are during life. Then, after death, they cling to the place they were in life, instead of crossing over. This seems like a complete waste of both experiences, and I do not understand it.
There! Charon turned his eyes to me, expectantly, each a swirling pool of pale blue. You just showed independent thought, I continued. You said it seems like a complete waste of both experiences, implying that, in your opinion, there exists a better use of both experiences. Charon took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling heavily beneath the dark cloak. We both smiled, and the fog curled around us in glowing wisps. Charon's pole swished through the water, and the skiff creaked and the water sloshed. How long until we reach the other side? I asked.
The crossing is up to you, he said. We will arrive when you are ready to.
And if I'm never ready, will we just never arrive? I asked.
I'm not sure, he replied. It's never happened.
So, when I was on the shore, there was a desert out there with a huge wall of smoke. Is that just for show?
That is where you came from. The smoke is a veil between there and here.
What would happen, I asked, if I walked out into that desert and through the smoke?
You would return to where you came from, he said, but you may not be who you were when you left.
So I would return to life?
Yes.
Oh my God, why didn't you say so? I yelled. This whole time I could have just come back to life?
Not come, no. Gone. You could have gone back to life.
What was the difference? I asked.
As I said, you may not be who you were when you left.
Meaning what? I asked. Please clarify.
Your previous vessel has died.
So what? I'd wake up as someone else?
I suppose so, he said.
Would I wake up as a baby? As in, be reincarnated? Do people do that? Charon nodded.
People often go back. You see, I know a bit about the world of the living, as it is the expectations of the living which shape this world, and the stories of the living that I hear when they get here. But I don't see clearly into that world. When the living choose to return to life, I assume they take up the mantle of a new identity, and then they cast off the old one at the veil, forgetting that they were ever here. Therefore, I cannot later ask them who they were in a previous life, as they do not remember their previous lives, let alone their previous identities.
I think I understand, I said. But do you recognize them? I mean, can you tell if you've seen the same soul twice?
Unfortunately, I cannot tell you apart from one another, except by whatever identity you carry here through the veil. I cannot give you an honest answer about returning to life. I simply do not know.
Charon, can you turn the boat around? Charon took another deep breath, seeming more and more human by the moment.
I can.
Charon gripped the pole tightly between his hands and lifted it high, plunging it hard into the water. The skiff stopped with such force that everything around us, the water, the fog, and the starless sky, seemed to shimmer in and out of existence. He pushed off hard, sending the boat backwards, so that I was once again sitting at the front of the boat. Immediately, we slid from the fog and back up onto the familiar sand of the shore from which I started. Were we that close?
Close is a relative term, said Charon. We are only ever as far across the river as you feel ready to be, and the river is only as wide as it needs to be.
I sat in the boat, gazing up at Charon and studying his face. His face had become so dynamic and full of personality since the first moment we'd met. His eyes danced about, implying intense consideration. His mouth moved and his lips flexed. There was indeed a being beneath that cold exterior. Though Charon had been going through the motions for countless eons, there was something, for lack of a better term, alive within him. Charon, I began, I want to ask you a hypothetical question. I know you'll probably have an issue with that concept, but for the sake of conversation, I'd like you to try to answer. Charon looked up at me, and our eyes made contact. I was no longer intimidated by him, but felt a connection, as I would with any other person. I know you're not human, nor have you ever been, but you've met a lot of us. Well, you've met all of us who have ever existed, so you ought to have a good idea how we operate. Also, earlier, you suggested that humans spend much of their lives conjecturing about the place we go after death. With all that in mind, how would you suggest I spend my next life?
My suggestion is probably meaningless, as you will most likely not remember this conversation after passing through the veil.
I know, but humor me, I insisted. How would you suggest I live? Charon's eyes darted away, and he lifted his head and took a deep breath.
I cannot speak to specific experiences, as every experience that a human has in life is unfamiliar to me.
He smiled slightly.
But hypothetically speaking, I would suggest that you not waste time considering what came before or what comes after. What came before is no longer, and what comes after will come in time. Life is but the blink of an eye. Receive each new experience with willing acceptance, and allow each one to pass away without clinging to it. When it comes time to pay the ferryman, do so without hesitation, and cross without looking back.
Charon seemed to deflate as he exhaled. There was a vulnerability in his face, a soulfulness. I stood, gazing into Charon's beautiful azure eyes. "Get out of the boat, Charon." He furrowed his brow and his mouth opened lightly, revealing rows of tiny pointed teeth. "Charon, what would happen if you got out of the boat and walked through that wall of smoke out in the desert? Through the veil?"
I don't know," he stammered.
"You remember a time before the boat, right? Before the river? Before your current form?"
"I don't remember things the same way you do. But yes, I exist beyond these symbols."
"Then cast them off," I said. "Are you even able to leave this skiff?"
"Nothing forces me to remain in it, but I've never had a reason to leave it."
"Consider it a new experience." I stepped out of the skiff into the sand, and Charon reluctantly stepped out as well, his long, thin legs showing momentarily from beneath the old gray cloak. He seemed to glide above the sand until he stood at my side, towering above me, his long stick at his side. He looked down at me and then up at the wall of smoke.
"While I appreciate the sentiment, I am necessary here. I am the—"
"I know," I interrupted. "You're the manifestation of a function. You're the boatman. Well, what if I were the boatman?" Charon tilted his head to one side, but remained looking at the wall. "Okay, clearly you're curious," I said. "That's obvious. So, what would happen? Maybe nothing? Then what do you have to lose? I'll stand here and hold your stick. If nothing happens, come back and get it. Are you afraid of breaking the universe or something?"
"I don't know."
"Hand me the stick, Charon. Just let me hold it for a second. See what it feels like to let go of it, to stop clinging to it." Charon looked down at the long stick, and then at me. He slowly leaned the stick toward me. I put my hand on it. It felt as I expected it would. "Cast it off," I said. "Cross over with willing acceptance." With great effort, Charon opened his hand, and the whole weight of the stick came to rest in my grip. It was far heavier than I imagined, and I struggled, at first, to keep it upright. I heard the fluttering of cloth and looked to see Charon casting off the old gray cloak. His face showed an unfamiliar hope and excitement, and a sapphire tear ran down the deep channel of a wrinkle. His body was pallid, thin and corpse-like, and his long, greasy hair and beard hung around his gaunt frame like corn silk and wet straw from an old scarecrow. He clenched his fists and began gliding forward, and then began moving his legs as if taking steps. His feet made contact with the sand, and he began trudging through it, leaving footprints which seemed to grow deeper with each step. I picked up his cloak, shook the sand out of it, and threw it around my own shoulders. It, also, was impossibly heavy, and I struggled under its weight, bracing myself against the wooden pole that I gripped like a walking stick. As Charon grew more distant, he moved more and more like an old man, like a human, until finally He faded into the wall of smoke, having never once looked back. I turned, and under the weight of my new accessories, struggled to step over the side of the skiff. As my feet hit the old wooden planks of the deck, however, I felt weightlessness return. My surroundings shimmered again. I felt the memories of my life slipping away, one by one, like cards from a deck. And I felt my sense of identity flickering, like a candle, until finally it was gone. With ease, I placed my pole in the water and shoved my skiff out into the fog, which parted for me like twin cyclones, spinning away from one another. I see everything. I become the manifestation of the function. I have always been here. Always. For as long as there has been life and death, I have been here. The boatman has been here to facilitate the crossing.